The speakers that we're having on this third panel are Jason Brook, who's Director in Navigant's Healthcare and Life Sciences Disputes, Regulatory Compliance, and Investigation Practice. Rob Kowalski, who's Head of Global Regulatory Affairs at Novartis, and Neil Chilson, who is the Senior Research Fellow for Technology and Innovation at the Charles Koch Institute. So I'll just give them a minute to all get up here. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked in the first panel about all the ways we're seeing AI, especially I think machine learning being used, and looking at new chemical compounds and the discovery process. We've had a lot of conversations now about clinical trials and new data sources that are being used, and how AI is helping automate different processes and accelerate the drug approval process and the validation process. Now I want to talk about, finally, in this last phase, of course, all of this is leading to the point of a drug actually coming to market that is safe and effective and that is approved for use. How should regulatory agencies be adapting to the growing use of data and AI in the pharmaceutical industry? I want to use that as kind of our level-setting question. It's just that there's this really big change, I think, that's happening right now in industry that regulators are grappling with. They're grappling with it at the FDA. They're grappling at it at the FTC. And we've seen some, as was mentioned earlier on the first panel, the current FDA commissioners come out with a number of interesting speeches on this topic. It's clear the FDA is kind of grappling with where it wants to go in this space. But I'd love to get some reflections from all of you about the direction that you think they should be moving. Robert, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. It's a great question. I think it's a great question to kick this off and put it in perspective. And I think you said it right. The word is adaptive. And I'll change that word a little bit and call it maybe agile. And I think we're in a space now where this is all beginning to converge. The biomedical science, the data, the artificial intelligence, our capabilities from operational efficiencies, and all these things are coming together. And we have an existing regulatory framework that most likely can actually handle most of this, but it requires some level of agility, I think, within both the regulatory agencies as well as within the industry. Because this is new for everybody. And as we always embark on new things, we have to solve these things together. And there's a balance between holding up what I would say is evidentiary standards on certain things. So in the last session, we talked about real-world evidence compared to full clinical trial data, and then something in between, which I like to call real trial evidence, which is better than real-world evidence, but they're real. It's real data. It's not made up or fake data. And where does that fit in this? And it really all comes down to this concept of regulatory agility, while maintaining the actual evidentiary standard and of course, patient safety. And then mix that in with, if you will, picking your battles and choosing them, of doing it in the right space with the right benefit risk, with the right compound and the right patient population, and begin to experiment and see where you can go with that. Mm-hmm. I think along the same lines in the last panel, they talked also about this concept that none of these wearables have, for the most part, been used as primary endpoints. Okay, that's where we need to go next. Secondary endpoints are really interesting. It's really interesting when you get to the primary endpoints. And can we convert some of these gold standard tests, the 6-minute walk test, which is one of FDA's favorite tests for all sorts of different diseases, and actually use something that's better than how far can a patient walk in 6 minutes? That doesn't measure, can a patient get up, can they sit down, do they fall, all these sorts of things. But the technology is only catching up now, and you then have to go back and validate that. So there's a huge element of, if you will, adaptivity or agility that is part of this going forward. And I'll use the word from the last session as well. It's really the evolution. It's not. I don't think it has to be a revolution necessarily. It's about evolving into this new framework that we're all exploring together.
Yeah. Jason, I mean, I know you track what the FDA is doing in this space very closely. So you can you kind of give a reflection on what you think you've seen, especially over, I think, the past maybe 12 months, 18 months, how it's moving, but also kind of how you think it might move in the future? There's a lot of kind of uncertainty there.
So in the last 18 months, I think it's FDA's thinking and approach to regulating these innovative technologies, particularly digital health, AI technologies, is a pace that's probably beyond what the FDA's ever operated at. Mm-hmm. It is, if you think about the digital health PreCert program, which I know maybe we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. That was conceptualized probably maybe 3 years ago, maybe. And they're looking at rolling out this program by the end of this year, and it really was officially announced earlier this year. Compare that to the medical device quality system regulations, which governs how a manufacturer designs, develops a medical device, and that took over a decade to develop, right? And it's an extremely complex regulatory regime. And this new PreCert program essentially, conceptually, will replace that quality system. So in a much less time frame, a third of the time really, are they able to develop a program that in theory will replace the existing approach to regulating medical devices and digital health technologies. So the last 18 months for sure has been rapid development from the FDA.
Yeah. Neil, let me bring you in on this. I mean, you were formerly at the FTC, so you saw firsthand a regulatory agency, I think, grappling with technological change, both in terms of what it was regulating and how it might do regulation itself internally, how it might think about using the technology. Can you give us your perspective, kind of both from your time there and now your time on the outside?
Sure. I feel like a bit of an interloper. I am not an FDA expert at all. But the FTC and the FDA do work together on a number of fronts, including advertising and labeling of various products, including supplements. And so I had some experience with that process. The FTC takes a quite different approach to a similar set of questions and a similar set of goals, but in a sort of a different domain. And so the FTC is the primary federal consumer protection agency, and its remit is pretty broad. There are a couple industries that are carved out, but overall, its goal is to stop, to prevent or redress deceptive or unfair acts or practices. And those, generally, the FTC is focused on areas of consumer injury. And so when we think about reviewing a claim about a device or a product, a supplement, what we're looking for is truth getting out into the marketplace? Are we giving consumers the information they need to make accurate decisions? Now, I think that's a very different, more of a sort of permissionless approach as compared to the FDA approach, which is more of a we need to get approval first approach. And so the FTC's approach is quite different, and I think the question that we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at this broad area of medical innovation is what things better fit in the FTC permissionless bucket and what things are probably still very clearly should be in the FDA pre-approval sort of bucket. And at the FTC, we've asked those questions around wearables. Not only does the FTC do advertising substantiation, where we try to make sure truth is getting out, we also look at privacy issues, data security issues around there, those issues, and those are important in the health space. There's a lot of information that devices collect, and the question is how do we make sure that is benefiting consumers and not harming them? And it's not just about the safety aspect there, but also the privacy aspect. And so the FTC has looked at this in cases. We've looked at them in cases that involved monitoring, moles on your body. There were apps that made various claims, and just in most advertising cases, some of these claims were okay, some of these claims were questionable, and some of these claims were kind of crazy. And it depended on the company. And so when looking at that issue, the question was largely, does the company have good evidence to back up what it's claiming? And is it conveying that evidence accurately to consumers? And what are consumers taking away from the advertising, and then how are they acting on it? And so in that space, it is very much a a question about what is the end result, much more so than it is a question about upfront, how does somebody have to design or develop a product. It's more about the end result than the upfront. So the big question is, which way is better for different product categories, and how can we split those up?
I have it's actually a completely unrelated question, but I have to ask it. At the end of every commercial for a drug, there's always the part that says, this drug may cause, dizziness, hair loss, night sweats, everything. And it usually goes on for, it would be a minute if someone was talking at a normal speed and they speed up the sound. So is that the FTC's requirement for disclosure to the consumer, or is that the FDA's requirement? Because it seems like it's a contradictory. It seems like it's a contradictory thing here, because it is disclosure to the consumer, but basically at the end of the ad, the consumer is completely confused about whether or not they should take this drug because of all the possible risk, of which they don't understand the actual risk levels.
Well, so I'm not sure where the legal obligation for that text comes from. I think my understanding is that there is mandatory disclosures that certain types of products have to make. Mm-hmm. I know it for a case in the sort of lending space. And there is a tension there between the mandatory disclosures that you have to make and the ability of the consumer to understand them. And we have really good behavioral evidence that suggests more disclosure is not always better. Sometimes disclosure is very confusing to a consumer. And so there is a tension there, but there may be legal requirements that they have that text in there, which is why they have it. So I think the way the FTC looks at this is, what is the overall message that the consumer is taking away from the advertisement, and is that truthful or not? Is it substantiated or not?
Jason, do you happen to know?
So the FDA dictates for drug companies, mostly, not as much medical device companies, but drug companies for sure, what they can say about their product. And they have the CDER, which is the center within the FDA that regulates drugs, has a program around promotional advertising there's a research center group within the center that conducts research around how the messaging that drug companies uses influences their decision making. And so back in the early 2000s, there was research around what a website looks like and what the size and color and placement of the font of risk information as compared to benefit information, and how the ratios of the font size of the risk versus the font size of the benefit information. And there was some discussion and prohibition of philosophy that drug companies used when websites were important, where you had a one-click rule. So the thinking was, as long as you get to the risk information one click away from the benefit information, then it was a reasonably close proximity, and therefore should be acceptable. And the FDA said that's not acceptable. They don't. They want the risk information to be has equal placement against the benefit information when promoting advertising. So that's why. But they're obviously websites different from a direct-to-consumer television advertisement versus the drug labeling that you actually get when you go to the pharmacy. So there's rules around all of that.
So that actually leads back to the main topic at hand. So that was a great segue there, because kind of the takeaway from that, I think, to me, is that as the mediums were changing of communication for these advertisements, the FDA had to think about what does this new technology mean for how we regulate, and I think that's one of the central questions that we're talking about here with AI. And so my question is, how does the agency think about adapting? How do they think about even just internally with staff? So many agencies, organizations in general right now, they're dealing with this challenge of, we know that AI is important, but we don't necessarily have people who know how to deal with it or how to create value out of it. Rob, maybe you can start first, just in terms of, kind of on the outside looking in, how you interact with an agency, obviously coming from a company that, AI is a core part of now what you're doing.
Sure, and there's different levels. I mean, the word digital is a big word, the word AI is a big word, and there's a lot of stuff in what is AI, right? And at a simple level, there are tasks that we do as an industry. Could be adverse event case processing, could be other things that is readily accepted by the FDA and other agencies, because you can go back and very clearly validate that artificial intelligence is just as good as humans or better in some cases. And those are relatively easy discussions, and we've moved through those, and we're doing those things. The agency's been very open and engaging. I think they look at where companies can pilot to actually do a pilot. We actually, make the investment to make pilots, and then when you prove that it's fine, then you're okay. Mm-hmm. On the other extreme of artificial intelligence, mining data for a new indication without doing a trial, doing in silico clinical trials and trying to get an endpoint, that's the other extreme, which we have a long way to go. And we're in, maybe infancy isn't even the right word, we're thinking about how to do that and looking at how we do that. And those are a mix of policy level discussions, which there's, I will say, great enthusiasm and tremendous support. And then there's, at the working level, reality of, okay, you want to change a whole paradigm, let's make sure that still meets the right evidentiary standard, as I mentioned in my opening comments. And so there's great energy and enthusiasm, but we still are at a point where, for I would say the richer AI, that we have a long way to go in just beginning to define what does that mean and what does it look like. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. So when you think about when you look at the FDA and the way that it's organized and the way that it operates, there are centers within that fall underneath the commissioner's office. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CBER is the Biologics Center, tobacco. So when the Center for Drugs or for Devices and Radiological Health, the Device Center, is much further along in the thinking around digital health and AI. The CDER is significantly behind. CDER is much larger than CDRH, and so there's a lot more budget to support what's going on there. And so but each center has their own priorities, and so the promotional and advertising aspects that I was just talking about is something that CDER has been driving, and sometimes other centers will follow on and kind of adopt what the CDER has thought come up with from a policy perspective, but oftentimes not. They won't embrace. They'll just either not do anything or they'll go in a slightly different direction. That's kind of happening here in the digital health domains, and it's kind of flipped from what typically happens. In this case, the Device Center is leading the way in the digital health, and CDER is kind of following what the Device Center is doing. And you would expect that there's a lot of crossover, crosstalk, collaboration, but it actually there's a lot of siloing within the FDA and within a given center. In fact. And so I'm not sure that there's as much communication between the CDRH and CDER as one might want if you're in a position in industry where you want the CDER to really be adapting their policies to new innovative technologies. That's not to say that they're not talking, but my understanding is that it does not happen at the level that we would probably want from an industry perspective.
And I would just maybe add a couple of comments. And I would say I don't think that's unusual for something that's new in any large organization, whether it's a government entity or one of our companies, right? That as you get into these new things, that it's really establishing those communication links within the entity, government or otherwise, to make sure that they're all beginning to talk on the same page. So there's definitely some leadership that's coming out of there. But I was thinking more, about your first comment. The AI that's been approved by and large today, and I say this without necessarily being a great expert in this particular aspect on devices, is really more about linear algorithms and if-then type decision trees. Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody's really moved forward with a dynamic algorithm. When as we think of AI, that truly highly intelligent algorithm of machine learning has not really moved through because no one's made an offering that way. And that becomes a whole nother, again, paradigm of how do you validate that system? Because on the true linear algorithms, you can go back and seek reapprovals every time you change your algorithm. How do you go back and seek a reapproval or a validation of something that begins to think, if you will, on its own, to be very simple about it? So I think there's a whole nother level of intensity that will come as these new generation technologies are coming forward that I think most people haven't begun to think of yet.
Yeah. Neil, I mean, I can imagine, the fact that you're a technical expert, and when you were at the FTC, there's a lot of smart people there, but I can imagine a number of them eventually started knocking on your door saying, would you explain neural networks to me? I've tried to read it and I still don't quite get it. Can you kind of talk about the evolution of how a regulatory agency just internally, thinks about emerging technology and its understanding of it and how it kind of grapples with new knowledge?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, there are a lot of smart people at the FTC, and there still are a lot of smart people at the FTC, and most of them are smarter than me. I just happen to have a very narrow slice of the tech expertise that can be useful sometimes. So the way the FTC tries to adapt to new technologies is, and because the FTC has such a broad jurisdiction, it's often jokingly called the Federal Technology Commission. And so it's encountered all sorts of things, like advertising. When it moved onto the web, we had to figure out how do we evaluate advertising there? What does it mean? And because the FTC also has a competition component, it has to spend a lot of time thinking about antitrust law in these spaces. And so technology matters a lot because technology matters a lot to consumers. And so when we're trying to protect consumers, we have to understand what's going on. So I guess I would say, and it's not directly on point, but maybe it's a good example of how the FTC adapts to technologies, would be an issue like blockchain or Bitcoin, which had come up when I was the chief technologist at the FTC. And the way it kind of came up was lots of different parts of the agency, sort of like you were describing, were encountering it in their cases, right? So they were seeing fraudsters who happened to have a lot of this cryptocurrency, and we were wondering, how do we get it? Or there were people who are offering fraudulent products that were sort of using the branding around cryptocurrency, but weren't really cryptocurrency issues. And so the question was, I was hearing from a lot of different people across the agency, hey, what do I do about this stuff? And so what we did is we set up a working group across the whole agency internally that could also provide a point of contact to all the federal agencies or the other law enforcement or the industry on the outside, so that they knew who to talk to, and internally everybody could kind of share knowledge. A next step, and this, I'm not saying this is the next step for blockchain or cryptocurrency, I'm not there anymore, but what has happened often in other places, say Internet of Things technology or big data issues or data brokers, is that the commission will use its convening function, where it will have a workshop. Or right now, I actually came here from a series of hearings that the FTC is doing on antitrust and consumer protection issues. And so that convening function lets them gather a lot of stakeholders in one room, hear a lot of different opinions, react to them, and then often they come out with a report that has a summary of the discussion and then also recommendations going forward. So that's the way that the FTC has tried to adapt to new technologies. And what we found out is generally, because the consumer protection statutes that we enforce are pretty broad, they're not super specific. I mean, unfairness and deception are kind of big concepts, and if the agency has the flexibility to apply them, and generally there isn't a need for new tools to be able to continue the mission of the agency under this, but there is a need for new information so that we understand how to apply those tools properly. So that's sort of been how the FTC has addressed new technologies.
Thanks. Jason, I want to go back to, you mentioned PreCert earlier on. I want to kind of dig into that specifically. So the FDA's made a series of announcements, as you mentioned, over how it's thinking about basically addressing some of these advances. And PreCert seems to be one of its big ideas for rethinking how it can regulate AI-based technologies. Can you maybe start with an explanation of kind of what it is and the genesis of the idea and kind of its current state?
Sure. So I'll start by actually giving you a little bit of a summary of the current regulatory framework for medical devices and digital health, which is, as I mentioned, the quality system regulation. So there are regulations that define what the FDA expects a manufacturer of a medical device to do in the design, development, and manufacture and distribution of a product. And when I say manufacturer, that's a legal term. That would include software developers. So software developers often say, well, we're not manufacturing anything. Well, yes, you are. So, so a manufacturer of a medical device or software developer today has to follow a very rigorous design and development process. You have to, the first step, which this is in California, this is really an awesome idea. It's called Lean Startup, where you actually go to your customers and ask them what they want. That's actually built into the regulations. You have to do what's called a user needs assessment. From there, you're supposed to develop very technical specifications which describe what the product's going to be at the output of this very well-defined process. Then you actually do what you say. You design it, you build it, you prototype, you test it, you do iterations. Then you look at your test results. You say, okay, did we develop something that we said we were going to develop? And if so, then okay, let's go forward and take it to the market. And all that information goes to the FDA. The FDA looks at it for the most part, and then says, okay, great, go ahead. So that's what's the current state. Now, many people saw things 10 years ago, myself included, saw that process was not really well suited to software development for many different reasons. And so the FDA, as early as 2008, started hearing from people saying, look, we really need to come up with a new way to think about this. So fast forward to, as I said, about 3 years ago, there was this concept that was the PreCheck, which now is called PreCert. And it was basically, okay, let's take the TSA PreCheck program and see if we can apply that to medical software, which is to say, if you're a good software developer, then maybe you get to not have to take your shoes off and take your belt off and take the water out of your bag. And so that's essentially what this program is trying to do. Now, when it rolls out, it will be a voluntary program. There are people who question, myself included, whether there's an actual statutory basis for rolling out this program. But you can either go down that traditional rigorous path if you so desire, or you can try out this program. Now, the program's foundation is based on what is called an appraisal assessment of the company's culture of quality and excellence. The current state of affairs is every device, whether you're a big company, small company, whether you make 1,000 devices or one device, it's an evaluation of the device-specific product development process, right? This new program will be a company-specific, not product-specific, company-specific cultural assessment. So, do you, company X, make good products? Do you have a culture that ensures that that the output of your product development process, whatever it is, will be a good product, however you define that? It's a very subjective analysis, whereas today we have a very rigorous objective assessment. It's a very subjective assessment. It's not very well defined currently. The FDA is still working through this. They put out a working model in June that would describe their current thinking. They're trying to take an agile approach to developing policy, which I'm not a fan of myself personally, and I think actually the FDA realized that there's not they were planning on a monthly basis to put out a new working document. After 2 iterations, they realized they got so much feedback and they can't even work through all the feedback in enough time to be able to iterate, that they're just going to put out a final draft in December and go with it and iterate as you go forward. So it's essentially a new way to get software through the FDA. It's only for software. And what's really important, and I'll stop usurping the mic, but what's really important is what this will do is it will eliminate the pre-market assessment that you were talking about, where companies have to show them the data of the development of a specific product. The FDA gets to look at it and says, okay, fine, go on to the market. Now I'm going to come in, I'm going to look at your company, see if you do good work generally, and from there, go right ahead, put whatever you want on the market. There are some additional very important nuances, but I'll yield the floor.
Thanks. Rob, I'd love you to comment on it. I mean, First of all, I actually didn't know it came from the pre-check. I think this is maybe the first time TSA has been held up as a best practice.
But you still can't take your water through, so I'm just
But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because I mean, on the one hand, I think first of all, it is showing that the agency is innovative and forward-thinking and even considering something like this. And second, I think it speaks to the fact that it recognizes there are current problems with what exists. Now, obviously, there's questions about whether this is the right solution and how it works. But you're obviously a company that directly works with the FDA. What are your thoughts on this kind of movement?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think anytime you try to simplify regulation, it's a good thing, I mean, clearly. Or try to find a path for something that is complicated and make it more simple. I think, and we're not a software development company by any stretch of the imagination, but if you look at, none of the big companies, if you will, and I use that, again, not my space, but they haven't moved forward with tech, really, in this space, because there has been this magic FDA line that is very difficult to cross for all the reasons that you just shared. We saw maybe something yesterday came out with Apple, and then I did a little yay in my office, because I think that's a very big step, both for the FDA and for that particular company. So I think that's actually really exciting. And I'm always a fan of, in the regulated space, to actually try new things and experiment and see if these things actually work. And I think that's part of what the PreCert will actually get at. At the end of the day, we still have to have a reasonable evidentiary standard. I said that before, and I will keep saying that, because the second we don't, then the agency's credibility and or the protection of public health, which is part of their mission, can fall aside. So there's always a balance between these two things. And I think we'll find out in whatever period of time whether PreCert makes sense, or whether there now are bad actors that come in and take advantage of that program, that then maybe it can't be as flexible as people envision. So I think it's a great experiment, and over time we'll be able to tell whether or not it's valuable.
Yeah.
So it's funny that you did a big yay yesterday when the announcement came out, because I've been pulling my hair out and my head's been spinning for the last 24 hours.
That's as a simple consumer, actually.
I want to ask about one of the other announcements that came out. I think this was a speech earlier this year about an internal data science incubator that they've called the Information Exchange and Data Transformation, or InformEd. And the idea is that it's going to, they're going to support the use of analytics in regulatory decision making. So they formed a partnership. I think they have one partnership with Harvard. They have another partnership that's external. What are the kind of challenges that the FDA might face as it tries to become a more mature data organization? There's all these, like there's a Gartner, cycle of the organization that basically has data in silos, and it's not really using data all the way up to the fully data aware firm that is able to use data basically at all levels of business decision making. What kind of challenges will the FDA face? Is it seems like it's trying to do a fundamental transformation in how it works.
So when I was at the FDA about 10 years ago, I remember it was Commissioner von Eschenbach was there. And I remember that there was a big push to improve the IT infrastructure within the FDA. And I remember when I first got to the FDA and thinking, and when I learned about some of the IT capabilities, I was thinking that I wasn't sure if it was still in the 2000s yet, because it was really arcane. There were efforts to gain funding to improve specifically for the IT infrastructure, and I think the ARA, the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, had a lot of funding that went into improving the IT infrastructure, which was after my time at the FDA. So there's a possibility that they've improved the IT infrastructure, but based on the outward public-facing access to data that the FDA offers, that improvement is probably very incremental at best. So one of the things that I think is going to be really challenging for the FDA as it embarks on attempting to use AI either for its own regulatory decision makings or its own internal research, because the FDA has, not many people realize that the FDA has a very significant research arm within the agency, is one, getting access to all the different disparate data sets that exist within the organization. I mentioned earlier that CDER and CDRH don't necessarily talk to each other all the time, and they probably don't have access to the others' data as well. So getting access to the data is going to be a challenge within the agency, and then being able to make sense of the data will be challenging because anyone who's developed an algorithm knows that garbage in, garbage out, right? And so if you're using AI to make a regulatory decision and you're using half the data that you might otherwise have access to, you may not get a very good outcome, or if the data is not organized in a way that is meaningful, may be very problematic for internal use of data from a regulatory, either policy decision-making purpose or a product-specific assessment. That said, there's a lot of opportunity within the agency because no one has the amount of data that the FDA has. Your company doesn't have all the data about all of your competitors, but FDA does. And so if you were to go to the agency and say, we want to put this product on the market, if the FDA had an ability to analyze, maybe using AI, all of the data sets that they've had for the last 20 years from all of the people in your competitive space, that may be a very powerful way for them to evaluate your drug or device to determine whether it should or should not be getting on the market.
And I will say, I don't have a lot of insight into this particular center, but I think any time that any big entity, whether it's government or industry or academia, is able to centralize and provide consistency in how they understand and interpret things, I think from where I sit, that's a good thing. When we go and talk to the agency, the one thing that is always challenging is inconsistency, and that drives us crazy sometimes, right? And we've seen more and more consistency coming out of the FDA over the years as they're trying to standardize their approach across different things. There's always nuances in individual programs, but if this actually helps bring consistency to interpretation and application of analytical skills and that sort of thing, I think that has a lot of value. We've done the same thing internally. We've created our own center of excellence around digital and AI and these sorts of things, because as we tackle policy issues and data issues and analytical issues and all these sorts of things, we try to tackle it once and not 10 different times in 10 different silos. So if this brings some consistency to that, I think it's a good thing.
So I want to ask about, when we talk about some of the new sources of data, it's often from things, it's electronic health records, it's the insurance claims data, it's wearables, and all of this is data that, in theory can be used for more real-time insights on what's going on for drugs on the market. And that suggests that, the FDA has always had to draw this line about, where it's going to do approval and then where it's going to do post-market surveillance. And, that line was drawn in the past based on the data that was available and its access to that data. And it seems like the access to that data is changing. And my question is, does that line about, where we say, well, something should be on the market sooner because we can do more post-market surveillance, does that change or should that change? And how is the agency thinking about, how should they be thinking about it, and how are companies thinking about it? Rob, maybe we can start with you on that one.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult answer because it's always so specific to a particular compound or particular therapeutic area. So I think to the extent, and the science of safety is always an evolving science. It's come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years before it was even a science, and so I think we're in a better place than we were. But I think you always have to come back to what are you proving and what is the risk-benefit. If you're talking about an incredibly rare disease, for example, where patients are literally dying if the therapy is not out there, I think that's a place where you then rely more heavily, and you track those patients more closely anyway, as opposed to perhaps a huge space where there are millions and millions of patients who will be impacted or exposed, and then what don't you know about that large population? And so I think it's always a balance, and I think part of this post-market surveillance is still immature to some extent when you start talking about electronic health records and that sort of thing. Yes, it's there, it's better than it's ever been, but it's not incredibly and entirely mature yet either. Mm-hmm. So I think we have a ways to go, and again, I think you have to just step back always case by case and see what's available, what are the tools, how can you do it, and then start to make some of those decisions. I think we would, I don't know if it moves the line back from an evidentiary standard, but you certainly can learn more post-approval, which I think is why there has been such a big push to understand real-world evidence, whether it comes out of the PDUFA legislation or just individual activities, because we think there's an opportunity there. Real-world evidence is not just about safety, it's also about efficacy, mm-hmm. and how both of those intersect in the real world. There's been some interesting publications in the oncology space about real uses of oncology products in the marketplace versus the actual labels, and there's a big gap. And should that gap exist or not? The people are asking and talking about those questions. Maybe, but maybe not. So again, I think this is another brand new area that's really ripe as we begin to embrace this concept of real-world evidence. So.
Does the FDA have a role in that it obviously has that role in setting the baseline for efficacy. But in terms of thinking about the future where you really want to target specific populations more, what's the FDA's role in helping consumers understand that they are right for a particular product, or how are you thinking about that future?
I mean, I can take a stab and you guys can jump in. Again, this is probably more of a personal belief. I believe that the label is much more than just a prescribing tool. The label today is being used for everything from very, very informed patients about what is this medicine that I'm getting, to access and payer decisions, to many other decisions. So the label has evolved tremendously from even just a couple years ago was a prescribing information. It is no longer just used as a prescribing information. So the endpoints that we look at, whether they are the true gold standards, whether they're real trial evidence, which I've mentioned before, whether there's something else, or other insights, patient-reported outcomes. From my personal perspective, is those more and more of those things should find their way, if they're robust enough, to make it into the label, because it is about sharing information. It is about information exchange. It's about a more informed patient than ever before, a more informed family, caregiver, and a healthcare system, including access. So I think as these things all continue to march, it is becoming more than just your typical endpoint. And I think, as was touched upon in the last session, the endpoints we've had, some of them are relatively archaic because they've had to be. Because there was no better way to measure this endpoint, because we didn't have the technology, we didn't have sensors. It's the best we knew how to do, best the agency knew how to apply. And so as new technology comes, can we actually get a better endpoint that is both a regulatory acceptable endpoint, a clinical acceptable endpoint, and you hope an endpoint that actually matters to the patient? So again, 6-minute walk, I don't think many patients care how far they can walk in 6 minutes. Mm-hmm. Do they care if they can get up and down from a chair, or walk up to their bedroom, or down the stairs? You bet they do. So I think, as some of this converges, I actually think that the endpoints will actually become more patient-important endpoints that also, I hope, could solve as a regulatory or a clinical endpoint, because we can measure things that we couldn't do before. So
Yeah.
Again, I think we're at the cusp of understanding this as this technology comes to play.
Thanks. Jason, I know I kind of went through 2 questions there. I want to draw you one on both of those.
Yeah, sure. So the second one regarding the FDA's role, so there are certain areas where the FDA has clearly been involved in kind of influencing the way that manufacturers use their drug or market their drugs so an example is in pediatric populations. So up until a few years ago, most medical device companies did not market their products for use in pediatric populations, because to do so was extremely burdensome in order to gather the data that you needed to gather to get the FDA get the FDA clearance. And so the FDA went to Congress, and Congress now forces manufacturers to consider populations other than the primary population that is intended to be used for. So the FDA certainly has a role in influencing manufacturers and how they deploy their products, because the FDA's mission is to protect and promote the public health. So I think they certainly have a role, and they do currently. Going back to the first question around kind of pre-market versus post-market, the PreCert program is the foundation of the PreCert program, and Commissioner Gottlieb and Jeff Shuren, Dr. Shuren, who's the director of the Center of Devices and Radiological Health, have embraced a philosophy that is the foundation of the PreCert program, which is that for digital health software products, the pre-market burden should be reduced, with the expectation that there would be a commensurate increase in post-market burden. And so in order to make it easier for products to get on the market, you have to then be able to be more vigilant once they are on the market, and require companies to be more responsive to change in the event that when you have a product on the market that is that's not functioning the way it's meant to, which most software products, actually all software products have that occur, that the company is obliged to, in some way, shape, or form, to respond and correct that. There's an existing, under the quality system regulations and the other regulations that govern medical device companies and digital health companies today, there are mechanisms by which you can do the same thing. It's the correction and removals provisions under the FDA regulations. This PreCert program, it's unclear, frankly, what the commensurate increase in post-market burden will be. And actually, when I've asked folks, senior folks at the FDA, that exact question, what if we're making it a lot easier to get on the market? What are we doing what are we going to do to prevent them from being on the market and failing? I haven't gotten a clear answer, and I don't know that the FDA has even thought about it, frankly.
Yeah, I want to stay on that same kind of tension between pre-market and post-market enforcement on the issue not just of kind of software-based devices, but also personalized treatments, where that same issue comes up. Is that how the FDA will likely try and regulate? Will it move more into that post-market surveillance, or will it stick with the existing model?
So post-market surveillance has a specific terminology, and there are so when you have like a pacemaker, for example, and drugs as well. But if you have a pacemaker and you can get what's called conditional approval, which allows you to get onto the market so long as you conduct certain clinical trials after the product is on the market. Those are called post-market surveillance studies. And one of the problems, and if you talk to folks within the FDA, one of the problems with that approach is that people don't actually ever do the post-market surveillance studies. And the FDA doesn't really have a way they could tell them to pull the product off the market if they wanted to, but there isn't really a much of a stick for not doing it, and so people manufacturers don't really do those studies. And so one of the goals is to kind of make that post-market oversight a bit more robust. And I want to correct what I said before. The FDA has indeed thought about post-market aspects of this. I don't know that they've articulated anything as it relates to the post-market. There are folks, myself included, who are very much focused on looking at, as part of this PreCert program, looking at post-market key performance indicators that the FDA can use as a means to regularly monitor performance of these organizations that apparently have cultures of quality and excellence, and ideally be in almost real time responsive and reactive to indicators that suggest products or companies are not performing in the way that they should be. But that framework is very much yet to be determined.
Great. Rob, did you want to weigh in on that last question?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably say something similar to what I said a couple of questions ago. Although on the pharmaceutical biologic side, that the post-marketing surveillance is much more robust, and FDA has real teeth when they want to use them. That's clear. Again, I think where that line is really depends, again, on the disease state, on the therapeutic area, and the overall benefit risk. And as new technology becomes available, whether it's being able to mine data in a health record and come up with a new indication where a medicine is being used, and filing a supplement and actually getting approval for that indication, maybe that's a place where that line moves. Again, it's just a hypothesis of my own, that maybe that's where the line moves, the evidentiary standard. When you have enough, you can get the indication, but then you probably want to, in a concerted way, follow up on that, from a safety perspective, or perhaps a little bit more of an efficacy, but at least you then make that available to patients with that particular area. So again, I think it all depends on, you probably aren't going to do it for, sniffles for a cold, but you might do it for something that's perhaps more of a serious disease, for example.
Yeah. Neil, I want to bring you in on this question because there's a long-standing tension, I think, between regulators about the extent to which consumers should have access to certain data or apps or devices. And I think the FTC, you mentioned the mole detection app, the FDA challenged 23andMe, right, on consumer access to their personal disease risk information. How should regulators be striking this balance? Because we talked about this a little bit on one of the earlier panels. The progression seems to be, just in general, it's about empowering the individual. It's your Apple Watch on your body, you have new data that you didn't have before. You want to compare yourself to other people, and you want to know what this data means. But at the same time, the FDA and most regulators are focused on regulating organizations, and they get very nervous when it's just individuals out there making their own decisions.
Well, I think that's a great point, a good question. Around how can we make sure, I think we all agree that the overall goal should be in empowering individuals and their doctors to make the decisions that are best for their individual situations. I think that's challenging. In the mole app cases, what the FTC was thinking about there was, how safe is this? And it was an advertising claim, and so they were looking at our consumers, what is the claim? And the stated claim by the agency when they wrote the complaint was that this was claiming to be equivalent to a dermatologist. Now, we didn't have any evidence that that's what consumers were taking away, and there was no explicit statement that that was the case. And so my then boss, Commissioner Olhausen, dissented in part on these because by writing that, by interpreting the advertisements that way, by saying that consumers were taking that away, what they were essentially requiring from these apps is that the apps had to have evidence that this app was equivalent to a dermatologist. That's not the right standard. Consumers can get a lot of benefit from an app that, even if the app did nothing more than say, hey, you should, here's a reminder to, check the various moles on your body, right? That is well established as science. That's a good idea. An app can do that, and having the app, no matter what it claims, is still going to be a benefit to the consumer, especially if it costs $2, right? So we're talking about these innovations that could benefit many people, including people who have limited access, perhaps, to medical professionals. And we don't want to put barriers in the way. And so from the FTC's perspective, the goal is to make sure they're saying something truthful, but that allows the consumer the autonomy to make a good decision, and gives them the information to do that. And I'd add in that it's not clear to me that we even have a choice about this. Where the technology is going, there's a great article by Robert Gabbois and Sarah Rogers. I'm sure I'm messing up his last name, but he talks about what's something that Eric von Hoppel at MIT has called free innovation. This is people developing products because they want them, and open sourcing them, putting the software online. And the example that they give is this artificial pancreas. There is a project out there where if you have a glucose monitor and an insulin pump, you can build this thing that you like, and that all the software is out there, and you can use it. So the technology is moving so fast that consumers are going to be able to try this stuff themselves. And so the question we have to ask is that the world we want, where the experts are having a tough time getting things into market because of the regulatory barriers, and so consumers are just trying it themselves? Is that going to be better for consumer safety than a market that allows the experts to bring products to market quickly? And so I don't know we have a ton of choice in this space. I think that's the trend, and I think that is part of why the FDA is starting to move in that direction, and I think it's probably the right move.
But so when, at the same time that the FTC was looking at these mole apps, they were also looking at apps that claim to use the light on your phone as a way to treat acne, which they apparently sold, I think, at least $15,000 worth of apps to people who wanted to treat their acne with the light on your phone. And so, I say that because it contrasts the thinking that if companies who are well regulated are having challenges or it's taking a little longer than they might otherwise prefer to get their products on the market, in order to ensure that when the products get on the market, there's a high likelihood that they actually work. The alternative is to allow companies or people, individuals, to create an artificial pancreas, which I can guarantee I would never use, in their garage, or an app that apparently treats acne using a light, which actually doesn't do, and sell $15,000 that's 15,000 people potentially, if it was a 99-cent app, who were duped.
Right.
And it may have just been in a 99 cents that they were out, or they, maybe they had skin condition that ultimately they never went to a dermatologist as a result of. So there really is the important question is, and whatever your perspective is that we need to find a balance. We need to, where is the line? And that has not been well defined to date.
Yeah, and I would say on those apps, I mean, I think the question that there does have to be a line drawn between the sort of pre-approval part and are we going to do enforcement after? And I think the light apps are a good example. I mean, there's tons of fraud out there, and the FTC brings fraud cases all the time. So the question is, would it be better for those apps to establish a regulatory regime, or if you're going to do any sort of app, you have to run it by the government first? I think that's probably too much, and probably stops a lot of these benefits. And it would definitely make it harder to develop an app. Or do we identify that app, which is pretty easy to do, as fraudulent? I mean, it kind of raises all sorts of red flags. And go after those people and get that money back for consumers. And that's it after the fact, because my sense is no matter how the good guys are going to follow the rules, they're going to go through the process. You're not going to eliminate these bad guys by raising the barrier. You're going to eliminate those bad guys by bringing enforcement after the fact, and creating strong incentives, that they go through the process. And so I think they're complementary, but I think just reality suggests that if it's this easy to develop apps, or artificial pancreas, then we need to think about how we're going to incentivize the people who are experts to continue to compete with that sort of, because you might not use it, but the person who doesn't want to wait 10 years for the FDA to figure out how to approve it may.
The reason why I wouldn't use it is because I'm a biomedical engineer and I know not to use it.
I want to ask one last question, then I'll open it up for anyone else that wants to ask questions. A lot of this conversation's, I think, been predicated on the fact that we assume data will be available. The data will be shared in clinical trials. The data will be shared from consumers. We talked a lot about wearables and all these different data sources from electronic health records. We're right now in the midst of a global conversation about privacy and how data should be regulated, data protection laws should be created. Europe obviously just went in an entire direction with general data protection regulation. And a lot of people in the United States are thinking about whether Congress should intervene, and California's obviously taken action. Health data has been regulated for a long time under HIPAA, but these new devices aren't necessarily covered in that space. So there's still questions right now about if there's new legislation, to what extent it might cover some of this data that we've been talking about today. So Neil, I know you've been kind of involved in these privacy discussions. I just love your reaction on what data should be protected under these types of laws, and whether we are moving in the right direction or what that right direction should be.
So because of the approach that the FTC has taken, which requires either unfairness or deception for us to bring a case, the FTC has focused on what the sensitivity of different types of data. And so there are several categories that the commission has said, this is sensitive information and requires extra protections, typically an explicit opt-in rather than the ability to opt out, perhaps, of data collection or usage. And so the categories are information about children, financial information, real-time location data, and sometimes health data. And it depends on the case, but generally people talk about sensitive health data. So this is usually like a diagnosis, or maybe a record of a drug that you're taking, the sorts of things and the goal of this is to try to evaluate what is the sort of thing that consumers would want to know more information about on average. And so that the line can be, so that companies can be informed about when the flag should be raised and when they should start thinking about whether they should do an opt-in or opt-out. And so sensitive health data has not, the FTC has not said that sensitive health data is, for example, your heartbeat. Now, in certain categories, in certain situations, that could be sensitive information if somebody could tell from that that you had a specific disease, right? But generally speaking, as a category of information, that your heartbeat or the number of steps that you took, especially if this data is not linked to your personal information, is unlikely to cause injury to consumers. And so even the misuse of it, it's kind of hard to imagine what a misuse of step data would look like. I guess it's theoretically possible, but that does not involve real-time location data. So the question really is ultimately what categories of information would be likely, if misused, to cause injury to consumers? And that's the kind of information that we probably want extra protections around. Now, what that says about how legislation should be written is very complicated. I think generally in the US we've had that sort of approach already. As you mentioned, Congress has made determinations that certain categories of data are so sensitive or the risk is high enough that they're going to put regulatory regimes in place on those specific verticals: financial information under GLB, HIPAA for health information, COPPA for information about children. So I think that's probably the right approach. I think it focuses on the real thing that we're trying to achieve, which is avoiding consumer injury. And it doesn't just focus on a check the box mentality about, oh, you're collecting information from a consumer, we don't care what type it is, but you have to do these 10 things. And that's, I don't think that would work as well as focusing on what is the likely outcome, a sort of risk-based approach there. So
there's another way to look at the privacy question, and it's from a individual liberty, civil rights perspective. And most people don't know that there's a case law going back to late 60s, that Supreme Court jurisprudence that says essentially, if you give your information to third parties, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy, which means that the government can access it whenever they want without a warrant. And that, and kind of the series of cases were like, the phone, the phone number that you dial back in the 80s that goes to the telephone company, and the telephone company knows what the number is, and they don't necessarily have the voice, the communication, but they have the phone number. And so recent times, that the government looks at that information for purposes of investigating terrorism. That line of cases has eroded what very little privacy protections we have in the United States. And there's actually an example that comes to mind that ties back to the conversation here, which is there was an individual who was suspected of murdering someone. This was probably in the last year or so. Suspected of murdering someone, and he, I think he confessed, and then he recanted, and so he went to trial. And the police used his geolocation data, his Fitbit or steps data, and heart rate data to demonstrate or to use as circumstantial evidence to convict the individual, and they ultimately convicted him, that he was at the location where the body was found, and that he had, based on the steps data and the heart rate data, that he had dragged the body down a hill into the river to dump the body, and then had to go walk back up the hill, and so it's a bad example because if he really did it, it's really obviously kind of no love lost. But the fact of the matter is you could envision a situation where someone was exercising, running in that area at the same time that someone was murdering someone, and ultimately the heart rate data and the steps information is used as a basis to convict someone. And the only reason why they're able to get access to that data, frankly, is because, one, we don't really have privacy rights in the United States, and two, the data resides with your whatever company that you use to track your health. So
can I push back just a little? I mean,
absolutely.
I 100% agree with you that the state of the restrictions on government access to data are a problem. I mean, we have, the third-party doctrine is a problem. It's a challenge. And in this day and age where data is so important, that is a problem. But to say that we don't have privacy protections in the US, I think is a bit of an exaggeration. Compared to, I mean, if you look at government access to data, we have more protections on it than, say, Europe does. Government access to data the US is actually better than most countries on. And so, and we have a private privacy protections that are not a rights-based approach, but more of a harms-based approach. And so, so I do think we have privacy protections here. And even in that specific case, I think we actually have more protection in the US. Not enough, but more protection in the US than the citizens in Europe.
So I should clarify, my comment really, actually, we don't have constitutional right to privacy. We do have laws that protect certain aspects of our privacy.
This is going to be a great conversation for the reception. Let me just open it up for...
I was wondering how you're going to take us home on that one, yeah. So.
Any other questions in the audience? We have time for one or two. Any hands? One back here? Yes.
So an opinion question. So Europe's come up with their GDPR, and we're taking a look at privacy questions. What sort of things should we be taking from that? What things should we be looking to do differently than that? And what kind of message can that give to other countries who may be looking at these issues so that it makes it easier to do business rather than we have 15 different competing privacy regimes out there that make it pretty much impossible?
If possible, I'd like to scope that question in the context of the use of the drug trials and everything that we've been talking about in this space.
I mean, I think that laws like GDPR are going to create an international standard. I mean, the companies are, and clients of my firm are multinational corporations, and they come to us to understand how GDPR impacts them, and oftentimes the policies and procedures that are put in place to comply with GDPR are just rolled out throughout the organization. And so, while today we might have certain state-based, like California or other smaller privacy laws being passed that make it kind of a patchwork of laws to comply with, I think that with time, organizations are likely going to just kind of go to whatever is the most burdensome law and apply that throughout.
I mean, if you look at large multinational companies, to some extent, and I'm not an expert in privacy for my company nor in general, but we almost have to trend towards the most conservative standard because our data and our trials are global. So as we look to solve, we kind of almost as we conduct trials necessarily have to gravitate towards the most conservative standard in most cases, unless there, for example, would be a specific country-specific program. But we don't do many of those, so we have to operate in this truly international environment. So.
Yeah, and I totally think that's probably right for the big companies. I think the small companies are going to have to make decisions about where they serve customers, and that I hope they continue to innovate in the U.S. But there is some challenge there for smaller companies who might think that compliance costs for GDPR are just too much for them to not worth the cost. So.
I'll just add that at the center we did a report earlier this year that looked at the impact of GDPR on the use of AI in Europe, and we showed how there were a number of provisions in that, in the legislation that basically limits the use of AI or will be harmful to the ability of firms to use AI in particular areas, particularly when we talk about accuracy and the efficiency with which they can deploy it. So I'll be sure to tweet out a link so you can take a look at that if you're interested. Well, first of all, please join me in thanking our panelists for this session. To wrap things up, I just wanted to share, I was at a Chinese restaurant the other day, and my fortune was, and I brought it today because I told some people last night they didn't believe this was real. The fortune was, put the data you have uncovered to beneficial use. So that's pretty much the theme of what we do at the Center for Data Innovation. I don't know why that's now in fortune cookies, but I guess we've had some impact. But this is what we try and do all year long, have events like this. So thank you for coming out today and being part of the conversation. And we do have a reception out there. Please stay and enjoy the conversation with your fellow guests. And thank you for coming.